The skies over the Bismarck Sea burn with smoke and disbelief. Japanese pilots once mocked the American B-17s, calling them flying dump trucks, too heavy, too slow, too stupid for war. But that morning, those same lumbering giants turned the ocean into a graveyard. Convoys vanished, thousands went under, and from the wreckage a new kind of warfare was born, one where the sky ruled the sea. If you want more untold moments like this, the ones history tried to bury, subscribe and stay with us. Because what happened next would change Japan's war forever. March 3, 1943. Dawn over the Bismarck Sea. A pale orange light creeps across a bruised sky as thick clouds hang low over the Solomon Sea. The air is heavy, sticky, and still. Below, a convoy of 8 Japanese troop transports and 8 destroyers slices through the gray water. Engines rumbling, decks crowded with soldiers bound for Leh. They've been told the route is safe. Allied planes won't find them here. Then, far above the clouds, something stirs. Dark specks move in formation, 4 engine silhouettes lumbering steadily against the morning glow. They look slow, clumsy, almost harmless from a distance. Japanese lookout crews call them Hikoki no Bakagata, flying idiots. To them, these American bombers seem too big, too heavy, too exposed. Flying dump trucks, but within minutes that arrogance begins to dissolve. Bomb bay doors open, engines roar. The first bombs fall through the mist, finding their marks with surgical precision. A wall of fire rises from the sea. By nightfall, the Pacific would remember this as the day heavy bombers rewrote the rules of naval warfare. By early 1943, Japan's Pacific Empire was starting to crack. The first blinding momentum that had carried its armies from Hong Kong to the jungles of Burma was slowing, strangled by distance and logistics. Every mile the Japanese advanced meant another convoy of ships to feed, and another chance for the Allies to strike. The Allied position in the Southwest Pacific, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, had been precarious after the fall of the Philippines. But from Australia, MacArthur rebuilt a coalition of U.S. and Australian air, land, and naval forces. His new instrument of pressure was the 5th Air Force, led by the sharp, pragmatic Major General George C. Kenney. Kenney understood something the Japanese still underestimated. Control of the sea no longer belonged only to ships. By early 1943, the Allies were tightening their grip on the airfields of New Guinea. Port Moresby, once a battered outpost, had become a fortress of concrete runways and radar stations. From here, Allied reconnaissance aircraft began to spot and track Japanese shipping routes along the north coast of New Guinea. The Japanese, desperate to reinforce their garrisons and halt the Allied advance, started organizing convoys from Rabaul to Leh, critical ports separated by roughly 500 miles of treacherous sea. For months, the Japanese had relied on the cover of night and bad weather. Their transports, escorted by destroyers, would race across the Bismarck Sea, hoping to slip through before Allied aircraft could locate them. It had worked until March 1943. That month, Japanese intelligence believed the Allies were still reeling from supply shortages. In Tokyo and Rabaul, planners dismissed the effectiveness of American heavy bombers operating from primitive New Guinea airstrips. The B-17 Flying Fortress was considered too slow to hit moving ships, too large to dodge anti-aircraft fire. Japanese fighter pilots joked that they could see one coming from 2 islands away. They didn't know that the 5th Air Force had been experimenting. Kenney's crews had studied ship attack tactics from British and Australian pilots, learning to use skip bombing, releasing bombs at low altitude so they'd ricochet across the water into enemy hulls. Combined with the high-altitude precision of the B-17s, it created a 2-layered assault the Japanese had never faced before. Meanwhile, Allied codebreakers at Port Moresby and Townsville were quietly reading Japanese naval messages. They intercepted one detailing Operation 81, a massive convoy transporting thousands of troops and tons of supplies from Rabaul to Leh. It was the biggest movement since the disastrous campaign at Guadalcanal. On February 28, 1943, 8 Japanese troop transports and 8 destroyers slipped out of Simpson Harbor under the cover of tropical rain. On board were nearly 7,000 soldiers of the 51st Division, bound for New Guinea's north coast. They believed they were heading to reinforce a front line, but in truth they were sailing into a killing ground. The Allies tracked them almost from the moment they left Rabaul. Long-range B-24 Liberators shadowed the convoy, feeding coordinates back to Kenny's command. At Port Moresby, squadrons of B-17s and B-25s were readied, fuel drums lined up on the tarmac, ground crews working through the night. Australian Beaufighters were armed with cannon and machine guns for strafing runs. It was a combined operation, something the Allies were still learning to do well. In the pre-dawn hours of March 3rd, radar operators near Buna detected the convoy moving southeast, just 60 miles from Lae. Orders were given. Engines coughed to life. Dozens of aircraft began to lift from the runways one after another, their wings heavy with bombs. To the Japanese, the sea still looked empty. To the Americans, the target was finally in reach, and in the next few hours the myths about flying dump trucks would vanish in smoke and salt water. The B-17 Flying Fortress had been born in a different war, or at least a different idea of one. Designed in the 1930s, it was built for high-altitude precision strikes against factories and airfields, not fast-moving ships. In Europe, that's exactly how it would be used. Fleets of them crawling through flak toward industrial targets over Germany. But in the Pacific, the B-17's role changed overnight. Here, distances were enormous, airfields primitive, and targets scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Crews had to navigate with maps taped to their knees and compasses that quivered in the heat. Instead of cities, they hunted convoys, long, narrow lines of ships threading through tropical storms. At first, results were underwhelming. Bombing a ship from 10,000 feet looked heroic in a training film, but over the Pacific the reality was brutal. Wind drift, cloud cover, and the sheer motion of the sea made accuracy almost impossible. Early B-17 raids often returned with nothing but gun camera film of water splashes. Japanese officers noting this concluded the American heavy bomber was a blunt, inefficient tool. They saw it as a threat only in massed formations, something that couldn't be sustained so far from major bases. But the Americans adapted fast. By late 1942, crews from the 43rd Bomb Group, nicknamed Ken's Men after General Kenny, were rewriting the bomber manual. They flew lower, defied doctrine, and learned from every run. They added extra armor where flak had torn through the fuselage. They modified bomb racks to handle new delay fuses that allowed bombs to penetrate ship decks before exploding. The Pacific theater had a way of stripping away theory. If a tactic didn't work, it died quickly. What survived was what worked under fire. By the time of the Bismarck Sea operation, Kenny had created a hybrid air force. His B-17s and B-24s provided high-altitude precision and coordination. The spotters and heavy hitters. Below them, B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs, and RAF Beaufighters struck at mast height, tearing through the convoys with cannon fire and skip bombs. It was an orchestra of speed, power, and experimentation, and the B-17 was now its conductor. The Japanese, meanwhile, were trapped in doctrine. Their convoy commanders operated under rigid naval traditions, with strict formation rules and limited radio communication to avoid detection. Their destroyers were fast and well-armed, but fuel-starved. Air cover was thin. A handful of Zero fighters that had to fly from distant bases, unable to stay over the convoy for long, and perhaps most fatally, they underestimated Allied intelligence. Japanese signals officers believed their codes were still secure. They had no idea that Allied codebreakers in Australia, many of them young mathematicians and linguists working in crowded huts, were reading their dispatches daily. Every ship's departure time, every planned refueling point, every turn in the sea was known. The Allies didn't have to search for the convoy. They simply had to wait for it. In the final hours before the strike, crews at Port Moresby were briefed with maps drawn from decrypted messages. "You'll hit them here," one officer said, pointing to a red line near Cape Ward Hunt. "They'll be in formation by 10 a.m. B-17 pilots, some barely in their 20s, studied photographs of Japanese ships, troop transports, freighters and destroyers, memorizing their silhouettes. They knew the enemy had mocked their aircraft, called them flying dump trucks. They also knew that their 500-pound bombs didn't need to hit every target, just enough of them to make a convoy burn. On the morning of March 3rd, the clouds began to lift. Radio operators picked up a faint signal. Japanese chatter, urgent and rising. Spotters aboard the lead B-17s reported a line of ships breaking through the haze, each flying the red sun flag. For the Japanese troops standing on the decks, it was their first clear sunrise in days. For the Americans closing in from altitude, it was the perfect light for bombing. And so began the most devastating air assault on a convoy in the Pacific War. For the men aboard the Japanese transports, the voyage was misery wrapped in heat. Each ship carried more than it was designed for. Soldiers, ammunition, horses, fuel drums, field guns, all crammed together in the hold. Air was scarce, space tighter still. The smell was oil, sweat, and rice gone sour. When the convoy departed Rabaul, the men cheered. When the first tropical squall hit, the cheering stopped. Most were from the 51st Division, veterans of China and the Philippines. They'd fought hard and long, and many believed this was simply another transfer. The officers told them Leh was safe. They'd disembark, reinforce the front, and drive the Allies back across the Owen Stanley Range. Few realized they were sailing into a zone now controlled by the U.S. 5th Air Force. They didn't know that Allied radar had already tracked them. They didn't know that their position had been confirmed by reconnaissance flights. They didn't know that enemy pilots were being briefed with their exact coordinates. In those early hours, Japanese destroyer captains ordered tighter formation, column after column, steel slicing through the Bismarck Sea. Lookouts scanned the horizon, straining for silhouettes or shadows. For them, the sky was the only unknown. What they saw instead were clouds, dark, layered, endless. The calm before a storm they couldn't imagine. From General Kenny's perspective, the operation was a calculated strike built on timing, deception, and altitude discipline. The plan was simple but revolutionary for 1943. Use high-altitude B-17s to shatter the formation, force ships to scatter, and then let the low-flying B-25s and Beaufighters pick them apart. It wasn't just about dropping bombs, it was about orchestrating chaos. At 7,000 feet, the B-17s approached first, flying in V formations. Each aircraft carried 6 to 8 500-pound bombs. They aimed not for individual ships, but the heart of the formation. The goal wasn't precision, it was disruption. If even one transport turned sharply to avoid the falling bombs, the convoy's formation would break. Once that orderliness dissolved, the Japanese defense collapsed with it. Below the clouds, Beaufighters swept in at mast height. They didn't drop bombs. They opened up with 4 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns, tearing into the ship's bridges, gunners, and communications arrays. Pilots later recalled seeing decks explode like matchwood. Meanwhile, B-25 Mitchells skimmed the waves using skip bombing, a tactic barely 6 months old. Crews would dive toward the target, release a bomb from as low as 200 feet and pull up sharply. The bomb would skip once, twice, and then detonate against the hull. The Japanese hadn't prepared for that kind of attack. For the first time, the air war over the Pacific wasn't a duel between fighters and bombers. It was an air-sea ambush designed to annihilate an entire convoy. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire was heavy but erratic. Their destroyers had limited firing arcs and couldn't track fast-moving aircraft at low altitude. Zeros tried to intercept the bombers, but without warning, coordination, or altitude advantage, they struggled. The American pilots, trained for survival rather than glory, stuck to their attack runs. From above, the scene looked like a machine breaking apart, a pattern disintegrating into chaos. And that was exactly what Kenny had planned. The B-17 wasn't the fastest, newest, or most agile aircraft in the Pacific, but it was the toughest. 4 Wright Cyclone engines could keep it airborne even after 1 or 2 were gone. Its aluminum skin could absorb punishment that would have shredded a medium bomber. Crews trusted it, almost superstitiously. Each flying fortress carried a crew of 10. Pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and 5 gunners. Every man had his own station, every gun its field of fire. From the tail to the nose, the aircraft bristled with 50 caliber machine guns, 13 in total on later models. The Japanese called it the Porcupine. In the Bismarck Sea engagement, that firepower mattered. When Zeros closed in from behind, tail gunners opened up, holding triggers until their barrels glowed red. Radio operators fed positions to other bombers, marking flak bursts and ship movements. It was a team fight. Man and machine fused into one working rhythm. And though the B-17s attacked from altitude, they weren't detached from danger. Anti-aircraft shells burst around them in black puffs. Shrapnel tore through wings. Pilots had to hold their formation steady. Just a few degrees of drift could send a bomb wide by hundreds of feet. When those bombs struck, the results were devastating. One hit near the engine room of the transport Kyokusei Maru split the ship open. Flames roared through the hull as ammunition detonated inside. Others hit the Teo Maru, sending men and supplies into the boiling sea. From above, the bomber crews could see tiny figures jumping from burning decks. Hundreds of men scattered across an ocean of fire. It was brutal, impersonal, and effective. The B-17 had proven something no one, not even its designers, had fully anticipated. That high-altitude heavy bombers, working with low-level attackers, could destroy a fleet at sea, and that truth would echo across every Japanese naval command post by nightfall. General George C. Kenney was no desk-bound strategist. He'd spent years flying, fixing, and rethinking airplanes, a mechanic in a general's uniform. When MacArthur gave him control of the 5th Air Force, the Pacific Air War was a logistical nightmare. Aircraft scattered, crews exhausted, spare parts non-existent. Kenney didn't complain. He improvised. He believed in innovation over tradition. When his pilots complained that standard bombing doctrine wasn't working against ships, Kenney didn't quote manuals. He told them to find what does. Out of that came the skip bombing tactic, perfected by Australian and American crews at Port Moresby's dusty airfields. Kenney's leadership style matched the new war, adaptive, pragmatic, and results-driven. He had no time for officers who clung to pre-war theory. What he wanted were thinkers, pilots who could experiment, fail, and return with data, not excuses. Under him, the 5th Air Force became a laboratory of combat. While Japanese commanders relied on rigid hierarchy, Kenney's airmen relied on trust. If a pilot said he could hit a ship from 200 feet, Kenney let him try. If a crew chief needed spare parts, they salvaged them from wrecked planes. Nothing was sacred except effectiveness. That mindset, flexible, restless, unafraid to break rules, defined the Allied comeback in the Pacific. And at the Bismarck Sea it reached its most lethal expression. Kenney's airfields were rough strips hacked from jungle and coral, yet from those primitive bases, he built an air arm that could reach across 500 miles of hostile ocean and strike with surgical precision. His men didn't just attack ships, they rewrote how air power could isolate entire armies. On the other side of the sea, Japanese Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura was guiding the convoy aboard his flagship Shirayuki. Kimura was experienced, loyal, and disciplined, a product of the Imperial Japanese Navy's rigid hierarchy. His mission was clear: deliver reinforcements to Leh no matter the risk. His escort of destroyers was formidable on paper, but he had 2 fatal weaknesses: ignorance of Allied intelligence and a deep underestimation of Allied air power. Kimura believed Allied bombers would struggle to find them in poor weather. He relied on low visibility and tight formations, naval tactics that worked in traditional sea warfare but were suicidal under air assault. His destroyers were spaced so closely that evasive action became nearly impossible. When the first bombs fell, Kimura's formation discipline worked against him. Ships collided as they tried to turn. Destroyers maneuvered frantically to rescue survivors, exposing themselves to strafing runs. Radio discipline, meant to preserve secrecy, now silenced coordination. The Japanese command system, built on obedience and face-saving, couldn't adapt fast enough. Kimura's subordinates waited for orders that never came. Lookouts screamed bearings and altitudes, but by the time the messages reached the bridge, the attackers had already struck. In Tokyo, the High Command had dismissed reports of Allied code-breaking as propaganda. They believed their communications were uncrackable, their routes secure. When word reached them that the entire Leh convoy had been located almost immediately after departure, some officers suspected leaks or sabotage. The truth, that the Allies had read their codes, was unthinkable. Kimura survived the Bismarck Sea, but his fleet didn't. In his official report, he wrote simply, "Enemy aircraft attacked repeatedly from high and low altitude. Situation became chaotic. It was a restrained, almost clinical summary of a slaughter. That contrast, calm, words over catastrophic loss, defined much of Japan's war bureaucracy in 1943. Pride had become its own form of blindness. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a tactical triumph. It was a moment when modern warfare revealed its coldest face. As ships burned, thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors struggled in the water, men who hours earlier had been enemies under arms. American and Australian pilots circling above faced an impossible question: mercy or mission? The orders were clear: leave no survivors to reinforce Leh. So attack runs continued, strafing rafts, lifeboats, and swimmers. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was cold arithmetic. Every rescued man could fight again on New Guinea. Every survivor was another rifle waiting down the trail. Some Allied pilots later admitted the images haunted them. Lifeboats overturning, oil-slicked men waving for help, the sea itself on fire. Others justified it without hesitation. If we didn't, we'd face them next week in the jungle. War had stripped away sentiment. It was efficiency that mattered. Tonnage sunk, troops prevented from landing, objectives achieved. But beneath the statistics was a human truth. Every victory at sea carried a weight that no number could measure. For the Japanese survivors who drifted for days before being rescued, or dying from exposure, sharks or wounds, the Pacific became an open grave. For the Allied airmen who returned to base, the cheers felt hollow. They'd done their job, but the smell of burning ships followed them long after the engines cooled. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point, not just in tactics, but in psychology. The era of chivalry between combatants, and if it had ever truly existed, ended there, somewhere between the smoke and salt water, and by nightfall, the myth of Japanese invincibility at sea was gone, replaced by silence, debris, and the distant hum of American engines heading home. March 3, 1943, 10:01 a.m., altitude 7,000 feet. Target in sight. The first wave of American bombers approached from the northwest, gliding above a pale sea that shimmered like glass. Below them stretched the Japanese convoy, 8 transports in 2 neat columns, flanked by destroyers cutting white scars through the water. In the lead B-17, Lieutenant Jack Bleasdale gripped the controls. His co-pilot adjusted trim as their bombardier peered through the Norden sight, calibrating for speed, wind, and drift. The men worked in silence. When the intercom crackled, it was only a single word: steady. At 10:15, bomb bay doors opened. 45 tons of ordnance dropped through the clouds. The bombs fell in slow arcs, vanishing into mist, then erupting in orange pillars. The sea rose in walls of spray. The Kyokusei Maru took a direct hit midship, a geyser of flame tearing her apart. Within seconds, she began to list, smoke trailing from her hull like a wound. On the Japanese decks below, chaos. Lookouts screamed bearings. Destroyer captains barked orders. Men scrambled to fire anti-aircraft guns that could barely reach the bombers. A few shells burst among the formations, but most fell harmlessly below. From above, the B-17 crews watched their bombs walk through the convoy like footsteps, bursts marching down the line. One transport turned sharply to starboard to avoid debris, colliding with another. The formation fractured, exactly as Kenny had planned. At 10:30, as the high-altitude bombers turned to circle back, the second phase began. Low on the horizon, dark specks appeared. B-25 Mitchells and Australian Beaufighters. Hugging the wave-tops, engines screaming, the Japanese, focused on the sky above, never saw them coming. At 200 feet, the Beaufighters opened fire first. Their 420mm cannon ripped through the bridges of the destroyers Horatio and Asashio, shredding crews, silencing gunners, and scattering command signals. The sudden horizontal line of fire left the convoy blind. Then came the B-25s. They dropped to mast height, roaring through curtains of tracer fire. The air was filled with the metallic crack of 50-caliber guns and the shriek of anti-aircraft bursts. Pilots released bombs that skipped like stones, bouncing once, twice, and slamming into hulls at lethal angles. One B-25's bomb ricocheted into the Iyo Maru, detonating near its engine room. The explosion tore through decks and threw men into the sea. Another hit struck the Taime Maru, splitting it in half. In minutes, 4 transports were ablaze. The rest scattered. Destroyers turned in frantic circles, dropping depth charges against imaginary submarines. Their commanders disoriented and cut off from orders. Above it all, the B-17s returned, methodical, patient, relentless. They came in from the sun, using the glare to mask their approach. Each time the ships reformed, more bombs fell. The precision was unnerving, a mechanical rhythm of attack and withdrawal like the tide hammering a beach. By noon, the Bismarck Sea had become a graveyard. Columns of black smoke climbed miles into the sky. Ships drifted in flames, ammunition cooking off in bursts. The Kyokusei Maru had already disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only an oil slick and drifting debris. On one transport, soldiers jumped into the sea, clutching rifles and planks. Some swam toward destroyers, others toward nothing at all. The air smelled of oil and cordite. The water boiled with burning fuel. In the radio room of a B-17, a gunner murmured, "They're just gone." No one answered. At 12:30, the final attack waves arrived. Squadrons of B-25s and A-20 Havoc sweeping low to finish what the fortresses had started. They strafed lifeboats and crippled ships, ensuring none could reach Leh. Each pass was brief, surgical, and merciless. From Rabaul, Japanese commanders could hear faint distress signals, broken transmissions of ships calling for help, then silence. Admiral Kimura, aboard the Shirayuki, tried to rally his remaining escorts. Rescue survivors. Maintain defense perimeter. The words barely left his lips before a B-25 came screaming in low. The Mitchell's bomb skipped once, twice, then struck Shirayuki's forward magazine. The flagship erupted in a single blinding flash. Kimura survived barely. His destroyer Shikanami pulled him from the water hours later. Around him the sea was filled with burning wreckage and bodies. By mid-afternoon, the convoy that had left Rabaul with over 6,900 men had ceased to exist as an organized force. Of the 8 transports, none would reach Leh intact. Most were sunk. Others would be finished off the next day. Above the inferno, the bombers turned for home. Their engines droned in unison, trailing faint black smoke, the sound fading into the sky. They had done what no navy could, annihilated a convoy from the air. And yet, as night fell over the smoldering sea, the battle wasn't finished, not yet. By dusk, the Bismarck Sea was unrecognizable. What had begun as a neatly ordered convoy now looked like the aftermath of a storm. Burning hulks drifted aimlessly, explosions still flickering beneath the surface as oil slicks ignited one after another. From above, the view was almost surreal, like a painting of chaos. Black smoke rose in thick spirals, blotting out the horizon. The sunlight, caught in the haze, turned everything a sickly red-orange. Even the clouds seemed to burn. On board the few surviving destroyers, Japanese officers faced an impossible choice: rescue survivors or keep moving. Every minute spent slowing down made them a target. But every man left in the water was one more soldier lost to Lei's defense. Captain Kajioka of the Asashio tried to do both. He ordered his ship to pick up men from the sinking Arima Maru, while keeping guns trained on the sky. As sailors hauled survivors aboard, someone shouted, "Incoming!" 3 American A-20 Havocs appeared out of the smoke, low, fast, brutal. Their attack was almost casual. They strafed the decks, stitched the sea with bullets, then dropped parafrags. Small, delayed fuse bombs that fluttered down like deadly confetti. One exploded near the aft section, shredding the rescue crews. Asashio was gone within minutes. Nearby, the destroyer Arashio tried to cover the withdrawal. Her gunners fired desperately at specks in the distance, unaware that the bombers were already behind them. A Mitchell came in so low that its prop wash rippled the sea. Its bomb struck just below the bridge, detonating the fuel tanks. A second later, Arashio's bow lifted clear of the water before crashing back down in a roar of steam and fire. The Japanese radio net disintegrated. Orders turned into panic. Survivors clung to wreckage, waving at shadows that passed overhead, not knowing if they were friend or foe. For General Kenny and his airmen, it was more than victory. It was vindication. For months they had fought to prove that air power could not just harass a navy, it could destroy one. The Bismarck Sea was their proof, painted in oil, flame, and iron. Back at Port Moresby, crews returned one by one. When the first bombers landed, groundmen counted the holes in their wings, dozens each, some barely holding together. Yet only a handful of aircraft were lost. For every American plane that didn't come back, dozens of Japanese ships lay on the bottom of the sea. Kenny's staff gathered in the operations room that night, plotting confirmed kills on a map. Red pins marked each sinking. The table looked like a rash of blood across the Pacific. One officer whispered, "This changes everything." He was right. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea shattered Japanese confidence in surface transport. Never again would they attempt a major troop convoy in daylight. The sea lanes to New Guinea, once a lifeline, had become a killing ground. Meanwhile, Allied analysts studied every detail of the attack: the timing, the altitudes, the coordination between high-altitude bombers and low-level attackers. They realized something profound. The key to victory wasn't just superior firepower. It was precision, communication, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy. But the cost was visible too. Footage from gun cameras showed the horror in stark detail: ships breaking apart, men leaping into flames, the sea swallowing thousands. The Pacific War was full of brutality, but this was different. It was the first time air power alone had wiped out an entire naval operation in open water. The next morning, March 4th, the final phase began. American patrols returned to finish what remained. The oil slick stretched for miles, a black scar on the ocean. Among the debris floated lifeboats and bodies, some waving white flags. The airmen had been ordered to target enemy survivors if they rearmed or reached floating equipment. In practice, that meant anything that moved. The reports were cold, factual, efficient. Engaged lifeboats. Results satisfactory. By noon, rescue destroyers from Rabaul reached the area, but it was too late. Of the roughly 6,900 men who left Rabaul, fewer than 1,300 would make it to Leh. Most of the rest drowned, burned, or were killed during the pursuit. On March 5th, Tokyo received the full report. The Imperial Navy was stunned into silence. The loss wasn't just material, it was psychological. The myth of Japanese invincibility at sea had been shattered not by another navy, but by the air. From that point on, the Pacific War tilted irreversibly toward Allied dominance. Convoys hugged the coasts, traveled only by night, and relied on deception rather than strength. The Japanese Empire, once built on control of the ocean, had lost command of it completely. At 17,000 feet, returning B-17 crews watched the last flames die beneath them. One pilot scribbled in his logbook, "What was once a fleet is now a funeral." He wasn't exaggerating. News of the victory spread quickly, though at first the Allies didn't grasp how decisive it truly was. Reports trickled in through coded dispatches. Convoy destroyed. Enemy transport losses. Total. But in the heat of the New Guinea campaign, even a total victory could be mistaken for just another operation. It was only when reconnaissance photos came back from the following morning's flight that the scale became clear. Dozens of blackened hulls still smoking, stretched across the Bismarck Sea like iron tombstones. Oil slicks shimmered in the sunlight. Debris fields ran for miles, proof that the Japanese convoy hadn't been scattered or damaged. It had been erased. General Kenny's headquarters erupted in celebration. Officers who had been arguing for months about tactics and doctrine finally had proof that air power could achieve strategic results on its own. There was no need for a fleet engagement, no artillery barrage, no amphibious follow-up. The B-17s and their escorts had done in a single day what once required entire fleets. The press caught on fast. By mid-March 1943, newspapers across America were running headlines like, "Convoy smashed off New Guinea" and "Flying fortresses turned sea battle into inferno." Even the tone of the coverage felt different. Proud but restrained, as if the editors sensed something historic had occurred. The Army Air Forces took full advantage. Official bulletins highlighted the teamwork of high and low altitude bombers and the devastating precision of the attacks. Publicly, the operation was presented as a triumph of American technology and training, a clean surgical blow against an aggressor. Privately, the airmen who flew those missions knew better. It hadn't been clean. The bomb runs were chaotic, the coordination improvised, and the risk enormous. A single hit from anti-aircraft fire could turn a B-17 into a torch. Many crews returned with their planes so riddled with holes they could see daylight through the fuselage. But what mattered most was that it worked. At Allied command meetings in Brisbane and Washington, the Bismarck Sea became a case study. Analysts dissected every phase, from reconnaissance to strike patterns, searching for lessons to replicate. They found several. First, heavy bombers could cripple shipping if used in mass and with intelligence support. Second, coordinated attacks at multiple altitudes overwhelmed defenses far better than any single approach. And third, perhaps most crucially, once the enemy lost air cover, the sea was no longer his friend. Those lessons shaped everything that came after. The same combination of radar-guided coordination, skip bombing, and code-breaking would define later Allied campaigns across the Pacific, from Rabaul to the Philippines to Okinawa. The Japanese, on the other hand, were left in disbelief. Their official report to Tokyo tried to downplay the disaster, calling it a regrettable loss due to enemy air superiority. But privately, senior officers admitted the truth. The Imperial Navy could no longer guarantee safe passage for its army. In the days that followed, Japanese search planes continued to find bodies drifting in the current. Many still wore their full field packs, as if they had gone into the water ready to march once ashore. Survivors rescued from the wreckage spoke of explosions so violent that ships seemed to lift out of the sea. One officer described the B-17s as flying fortresses indeed, unassailable in the sky, merciless below. The psychological impact was devastating. The Imperial Japanese Army began shifting from large coordinated offensives to isolated garrisons, hoping to defend what they already held rather than expanding further. The southern advance, the dream of a Pacific empire stretching to Australia, was over. For the Americans, the victory also marked a quiet turning point in identity. The B-17 crews, once dismissed as out of place in the Pacific, had proven their aircraft could dominate any battlefield, land or sea. The myth of the flying dump truck was dead. In its place stood the image of a machine that had not only endured ridicule but rewritten the rules of war. And yet, even as the headlines faded, the smell of burnt oil and iron lingered in the memories of those who flew that day. In the months following the Bismarck Sea operation, Allied airfields across New Guinea buzzed with quiet confidence. Something fundamental had changed, not just in tactics but in belief. For the first time, commanders truly saw the sky as the dominant battlefield. Until then, most military planners had treated air power as support, an extension of the ground or sea forces. Bombers softened targets. Fighters protected convoys, but after March 1943 the hierarchy flipped. Now the question wasn't how air power could help, it was how everything else could support it. General George Kenney pressed this point relentlessly. He used the Bismarck Sea victory as proof in every report to Washington. "We can sink ships without ships," he wrote, "and break armies without armies." His superiors listened. Resources once bound for naval projects were redirected to expand the 5th Air Force. New radar stations, longer runways, and fresh bomber groups arrived in the Pacific in waves. The B-17, though soon to be replaced by the more modern B-24 and later the B-29, became a legend. Its name carried weight now, not just as a machine but as a symbol of adaptation under fire. Crews who once flew long, uncertain patrols over empty sea now saw their mission differently. They weren't searching for targets anymore. The targets were searching for them. The Japanese High Command faced a nightmare of its own making. Their naval supply system had already stretched to the breaking point but began to collapse. Every convoy to New Guinea required destroyer escorts, fuel they couldn't spare, and air cover they couldn't guarantee. The Imperial Army was forced to ration ammunition and food at the front. In Leh and Salamaua, troops fought with half rations and no medical supplies. By mid-1943, Japan had effectively abandoned large-scale convoy operations in daylight. The once proud merchant fleet, Maru ships as they were known, became nocturnal, creeping along coastlines under the cover of darkness. Even then, Allied aircraft hunted them with radar and flares. The sea, once Japan's domain, had become its graveyard. Historians would later call the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the death of Japanese seaborne mobility. In practical terms, it meant their empire stopped expanding. Their troops, stranded across distant islands, could no longer be reinforced or resupplied. The chain of victories that had carried Japan from Pearl Harbor to the gates of Australia snapped in one violent week. For the Americans and Australians, the psychological reward was immense. The Pacific had always felt endless, an ocean of distance and uncertainty. But now, with each wrecked ship and burned convoy, it began to shrink. The enemy who once seemed invincible was suddenly vulnerable, even predictable. Still, those who flew the missions carried scars that didn't fade with victory. In interviews decades later, B-17 crewmen spoke of the battle with a kind of restrained unease. One gunner recalled seeing hundreds of dots in the water, men, rafts, debris, and realizing most of them wouldn't make it home. Another said simply, "It was war, but it didn't feel like winning." Their commander, General Kenney, understood that duality. He described the outcome as a great victory bought with grim necessity. In his memoirs, he never glorified it. He wrote instead about the evolution of war, how speed, intelligence, and precision had replaced brute strength. "We learned," he said, "that courage without adaptation is suicide." In the decades that followed, military academies studied the Bismarck Sea battle as a blueprint. The principles born there, intelligence-driven strikes, multi-layered coordination, and flexible tactics, became cornerstones of modern air warfare. You can trace a direct line from those B-17s diving through smoke to the satellite-guided bombers of today. Yet for all its technological lessons, the essence of that battle was still human. It was about men inside a tin-skinned fortress, trusting one another as they descended into fire and chaos. About young pilots rewriting the rulebook in real time, because the war demanded it, and above all, It was about the moment the world realized the age of the battleship was ending and the age of the bomber had begun. War has a way of testing ideas as much as armies. At the start of World War II, Japan believed in steel, the empire's power measured in the tonnage of its ships. The United States believed in endurance, that if it could outbuild, outfly, and outlast, victory would follow. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved something else entirely, that survival in modern war belongs to those who adapt faster than they fail. The Japanese entered that battle with discipline, courage, and conviction. What they lacked was flexibility. They relied on the same naval doctrines that had carried them across the Pacific, convinced their destroyers and convoys could outrun or outfight anything the enemy threw at them. They were wrong. The Americans entered it underprepared, understrength, and largely improvising. But they learned, on the job, under fire, in real time. They adjusted altitudes, rewired bomb fuses, changed formations, and even ignored the rule books written by their own generals. In doing so, they transformed the B-17 from a clumsy fortress into a weapon of precision and fear. That's the real story behind those flying dump trucks. They weren't elegant, they weren't fast, but in the hands of inventive crews and stubborn commanders, they became something no enemy could predict or survive. In 1 week of battle, the Pacific shifted. Japan's illusion of invulnerability was broken. The Allies had learned to weaponize intelligence, technology, and speed, not separately, but together. For the men who flew those missions, the victory was heavy. They saw not just enemy ships sinking, but thousands of men disappearing beneath the waves. Men who a few years earlier might have been their classmates, mechanics, or pilots in another uniform. One pilot later said, "We didn't hate them, we just had to stop them." That's war at its most honest, brutal necessity dressed as progress. And so the Bismarck Sea became more than a battle. It became a warning that technology without understanding breeds arrogance and that mockery can turn to fear in a single day. The Japanese had laughed at flying dump trucks. By the time the smoke cleared, those same dump trucks had rewritten the future of warfare, one burning convoy at a time. The wrecks still rest beneath the Bismarck Sea, silent, rusting, forgotten by time. Once they were symbols of empire. Now they're reminders of what arrogance costs. Every story like this deserves to be remembered, not glorified but understood. Subscribe, share, and keep these echoes of history alive. So they're never lost to the deep because the sea still remembers, even when we don't.